welcome to our last session for day one for highscore. We are going to be hearing from Joanna Fang and Blake Collins. Now, Blake is the senior Foley mixer at PlayStation Studios and a certified audio engineer with a background in film and TV spanning 16 years. And Joanna is an Emmy Award-winning Foley artist and sound editor who also began her career in film, training with the acclaimed New York Foley artist Leslie Bloom. After 7 years, she transitioned into game development, where she and Blake established the Foley department at PlayStation together in 2021. Joanna and Blake have had long and varied careers, so I'm sure they have some very great stories to tell us. Please welcome them to the stage.
Real quick, we're just gonna put our gear into the right table, so give us one moment.
I'm not nervous, but everybody else in the room is nervous, so it's okay. You guys want to do a thing? If everybody could stand up. Everybody stand up. And sit back down.
Way too hot. Now you know what it's like to be Foley. Just finishing up here. So, hi everyone. How's it going?
There's been some great panels today.
Yeah,
you guys agree? Yeah, maybe, no, kind of, yeah.
Yeah, it's been fantastic seeing all these wonderful developers, and I think there was definitely a moment where usually when we go to game conferences, we're like the only sound nerds. So there was just this brief moment when we were sitting back there, and I was like, oh my God, we're with our people right now. Anyways, thanks so much for coming out. Today's talk is about Foley design for interactive media, or how we stopped worrying and learned to love Google Sheets. And thus, it begins. So really quick, we are the PlayStation Foley team. Specifically, we work for a department called the Sony Playstation Studios Creative Arts Sound Department. We provide sound design, dialogue, and Foley services to music to all of our first-party developers. Actually, pretty much all of our developers, first-party, second-party, external development, and it's been an incredible ride. But we are just two people in a massive global team that spans everywhere from Japan to Canada to the United Kingdom. And throughout the years, we've worked on a lot of really cool projects. Obviously, I actually put a few, like The Light Between Oceans was filmed in Australia, if I remember correctly. But basically, as you can see, we had very extensive careers in film and television before we went over to Sony PlayStation to focus exclusively on interactive Foley. So obviously, I came from the New York Foley world at Alchemy Post Sound. And Blake, do you want to talk about where you came from?
I started in Hollywood, working at Fox and Paramount, and then I made my way up to Skywalker Sound for a few years, and then over to PlayStation in 2021.
Yeah, we combined Blake's background and expertise with like really big budget, high octane Foley. Like Foley as if they were sound effects, right? And my career in the independent film industry, which is so much based on like character films, horror genre films. And so we're able to get really quiet, subtle stuff, as well as the really loud and like wild sound design stuff. So we're a team from a diverse range of experiences in life and film, and we're really totally invested in audio-driven storytelling. And so I thought it was a good idea to put like slow fade transitions, but sometimes it makes me feel like I'm trying to slow down. A few years ago, I wrote this blog for ProSoundEffects.com called The Other F Word, Defining Foley. It's kind of based on George Carlin. He has this great little stand-up bit about the F word and kind of how it has so many different uses. They use it as a noun, a verb, a gerund, all these wild phrases, like wild words you haven't heard since grammar school, effectively. But in a lot of ways, Foley is like the other F word, I think a lot of people perceive Foley as a literal product, a noun, a type of audio asset for characters and objects, typically composed of wave files depicting footsteps, cloth, rustle, movement, and props. And I think in general parlance, that's kind of how we talk about Foley, right? So people are like, oh, the Foley needs to sound like this, or we need to get some Foley for that. Versus the definition that Blake and I use the most. Do you want to read this one?
Yep. Foley as an impressionistic process, a verb. So this is going to be the performance and production of custom sounds synchronous and characterized by moving objects, persons, or conceptual entities.
Yeah, that's like the widest, most abstract way we can put what Foley is. And the reason why I say that is because often Foley isn't just like character sounds, right? Sometimes it's like, oh, we want to nail how a tree moves in the wind, or this rock tumbling has to have a menace to us that we're just not finding in a sound effect library. So we're trying to mend these two definitions of Foley and mend these two concepts of what Foley are. And to that end, we think of it as the creation of sound assets imbued with performance, character, and story. So a hero and a villain might be in identical clothing, but we're able to define who each of them are and what they sound like by the performance.
Sounds that need to be concepted and performed with intelligent design prior to audio conversion. So we're constantly like figuring out what needs to be the motivation and stuff behind the sound or the idea of it. I guess an example would be a strong mid and weak punch versus a kick.
Right. So it's like we need to perform the sound in the room fully aware of how it's used in the game, right? And the last one is sounds that are recorded for bespoke purposes rather than utilitarian needs. And what I mean by that is, you know, it's the difference between a footstep from a library, just like a generic sound effects library that you might have that has the sound of footsteps in it, versus crafting a footstep for a non-player character system, right? Let's say you're working on a game with a bunch of different city folk. How we design that entire Foley system is going to be very specific for its deployment in a game. And so also we do understand that we come from a background in AA and AAA gaming, so we're really lucky that we have this hyper niche focus on Foley. You know, I think most people have to do their own Foley in game development, but we were super lucky that we can.
I mean, even before we were at PlayStation, all the sound designers there were doing their own Foley, except for the few times where they would hire out vendors at Skywalker or Warner Brothers or something like that.
Yeah, it's easy to send all your cinematics to like a team in Burbank, California, but then all the weird little in-between Foley needs used to be absorbed by our sound designers who had to then meticulously match stuff. So we're kind of brought in to fill that gap and provide Foley for like all of our creative services. So this talk is going to focus on basically Foley for cinematics, gameplay, and everything in between. And we're gonna try to quantize that during 3 stages of production. Dang fades. It should just be hard cuts. I'm a hard cuts girl. So this is the spectrum of Foley needs. We have cinematics, which are short animated content with basically little player input, right? They play out like movies.
Yeah, all your cutscenes, that kind of stuff. Then we go into gameplay, which is the interactive player-triggered action interversal. So all your stuff you're doing with the controller as a player.
Right, stuff you're directly in control over. We have vignettes, these scripted moments, QTs. There's a lot of phrases that they use nowadays to describe these, but basically it's partially linear work with non-linear interactivity. So imagine, if you will, with a game like God of War Ragnarok, you might have sequences where you have to mash this, like you have to mash square to break out of a hold, right? And so it's non-linear in the sense that this is going to happen. It happens pretty much the same way every time, but whenever you press that square button, we have to hear the sound of like a struggle or a punch or a kick. And so that work is considered interactive, and then the rest of it's almost like a cutscene. You want to talk about branching possibilities there?
In those moments where you have a fail state or a success state, you're mashing the button. If you don't mash it hard enough, you have a fail state. So that's where linearly you're going to either have the fail or success.
The other cool thing about vignettes is that, let's say you walk into a bar in a video game, you might see somebody arm wrestling in one corner, somebody playing pool in the next, somebody playing an arcade game in another corner. We have to cover all of that.
Yeah.
And so basically, it's non-linear in the sense that you can bob and weave through these little scripted moments all around you, but each one of those people has a linear performance that sometimes breaks off into these perfect little non-linear loops. So it gets really confusing. It's not quite a cinematic.
Yeah.
It's not quite gameplay. It's just somewhere in between. And you want to talk about
Yeah. Then there's source sounds, and that might be unique to Joanna and I's position because we do work for PlayStation with our sound designers in-house, but then we work with all the other first-party studios like Sucker Punch, SMS, SDS, all the first-party studios that PlayStation owns, and we get to just give them source to work with for their design. So if they're working on a character like Thor or something and they need a sound of a snap for recalling that hammer, or even the hammer grab itself for Thor, we can just go to town and record a bunch of things and then throw it over to the sound designers, and they get to cut it up, affect it however they need to.
Yeah, oftentimes that's one of our biggest crossovers with individual sound designers, because they'll be like, hey, we need like 30 different resonating metal weapons for Thor's hammer. So we're like, okay. So we basically give them like an all-you-can-Foley buffet of just like pure raw metal, right? And they get to pick and choose, figure out what they like, and very often they'll get back to us and be like, hey, I loved recording 1, 3, and 5. Can we use that for the rest of the game? And we're like, yeah, sure. So that's kind of the full spectrum of our Foley needs. And then all that gets put into 3 processes: pre-production, production, and post-production. So pre-production's different for every project, where we're constantly concepting and finding props for early key story points, as well as unique gameplay features. So if we know a game in particular, let's usually use an example. Let's say there's let's say there's like a billiards game, right? So okay, we know we're working on a billiards game, so we have to get pool cues, we have to get chalk. Yeah, we start figuring out all of our needs then. They're like, oh, there's a unique gameplay feature. It's like, what's that? It's like, if you, I don't know, what's...
Spin move with the pool cue behind your back to trick shot 8-ball corner pocket.
It's like, okay, that's good to know. Like we'll start thinking about that, Production is the actual creation and performance of Foley for scenes, gameplays, vignettes, and sound effects. So that's really where we're getting the meat of it. That's when I strap on my best looking boots. They look terrible. I don't even know how we got these through the border, covered in soil. No, but basically, that's when we actually go in there and we start going after every cinematic, every gameplay system, and the last thing we do is post-production. Yeah,
post-production. So as good as Joanna is at sync when doing linear content, that still needs to be edited to picture. And then when we do asset creation, all that has to be edited, chopped up, mixed, mastered, and sent off to the implementers. And then there's the testing through QA and that kind of thing, and making sure what we've done and shot is working in the game itself.
Yeah, and the other thing to think about is, because Blake and I work for PlayStation's service group, we're doing all 3 of these across all 4 of those pillars of work simultaneously for multiple titles all at once. So
it's a lot to juggle.
It's a lot to juggle. It's like I constantly have weird dreams, like weird mashup of video games, because I'm just like, oh, all those axe sounds we did for God of War, and meanwhile we're like finishing Horizon Forbidden West at the same time. So you can imagine how cool it is to have that just running in your mind. So basically all 3 of these phases of production and all 4 of those needs are constantly being worked on at our studio. So let's talk a little bit about pre-production. We're going to talk a little bit about how we strategize for success. And you're going to notice that pretty much every phase in production, we have this design methodology. We have this philosophy about how we want to work. First thing we do is we try to understand pre-existing content and pre-existing Foley systems in play. So Horizon Forbidden West is a...
Big game.
Big game. It's also a sequel.
Yeah, it's a sequel. We're a sequel team so far at Sony.
Yeah, it's we like God of War Ragnarok, a sequel. Right, Spider-Man 2, a sequel. Well, there's 2 in the name. So a lot of that times that means that we're already going into games that have Foley pre-made from the previous title, right? And so we have to learn what that Foley is and learn how it was deployed, so that way we can effortlessly merge in with like the next iteration of the title. Other times we're working with completely new IPs and new engines, so that means we have to consult on new Foley systems. Yeah. So like, what does that look like?
It's talking to audio directors, it's talking to game directors, audio technical designers, and seeing how their Foley systems are going to work to see what kind of assets we need to deliver to them, all that kind of stuff to make sure they can be used.
Like if we're working with a team that likes to like procedurally generate like event tags and stuff, we need to know that. If we're working with a team that really cares about stealth, we'll have to be like, oh, okay, so you have an entire stealth system. How is that stealth system triggered? When do we go into stealth feat, right? And so we often get a chance to consult on new Foley systems. The other thing we get to do is we get to read scripts and just basically work as a dev. Like we're developers first, Foley team second. Blake and I might have had a really long career in film and television, but we really see ourselves as devs, right? And that means that we have to be onboarded just the same as any other person on a massive AAA title. And as a result, we learn character motivations, and we're trying to develop a sense of the bigger picture, right? It's really easy when you're lost in the sauce, focusing on like one 30-second cinematic, to forget like, oh man, this is like Act 2. Like there's way bigger fish to fry. Like we're setting things up for later.
Yeah, it seems like so often in the pipeline of production from like visual arts, we're getting cinematics and story beats that could be at the end of the game or whatever. So if we aren't reading our scripts, if we aren't figuring out where in the pipeline this story is taking place, we might not put the right emphasis or the right emotion behind the footsteps or the movement, depending on wherever they are.
Yeah, like most actors, when they go to a film set, they don't shoot the film in order, right? And so by same token, Foley doesn't get deployed onto games in linear order either. So we're often just thrown a jumble of scenes, whatever's ready to go for Foley, and we have to be the ones to maintain knowledge of where we are in the game. And exploring and acquiring additional tools. Do you want to talk a little bit about Old Sparky?
Yeah. So, like when we moved into the Sony Foley stage, which was built very well, but it was stocked with props and stuff from the sound designers, and there's just the tips and tricks and stuff that Joanna and I know of props and stuff that we need just from film that weren't there, and if we don't have it, we have to make it. So we visited Sony Pictures and saw Gary Hecker's stage over there, and he had like this big Game of Thrones metal construction chair looking thing, and that just sparked something in us. We're like, oh my gosh, he has all of his metal components in like one area, they're built in one spot, like that would be great. And so like because of our position where we're at and just the support that Sony has for us, they let me learn to weld and was able to make a big chair looking thing, and we call it Old Sparky. It's got different types and sizes of metal on it, and it was great for working on Spider-Man where he's in New York where there's all sorts of railings and yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, the sound of metal is really tough. I think anyone here who's ever stepped on like a metal plate in a Foley stage, like, dang, it doesn't sound like metal. It's like you have to suspend that thing, right? So the thing about Old Sparky is it looks like an electric chair. So that's why we call it Old Sparky. So a little bit messed up, but every time I see it, I'm just like I have like a glimpse of my mortality for a hot bit. That's what we mean by exploring additional tools. Another fun example of that is our first, for some reason, so this is a great example where us as film Foley people are adapting to game needs. For some reason, metal pipes are like the single most like recurring motif in like the history of video games. Like
big, unnecessary metal pipes.
Yeah, like huge, like
you walk through them. Like
yeah, you're able,
that doesn't exist.
Yeah, in films, if we have to do a big metal pipe sound, it's like, all right, we'll just walk on metal and add water, I guess. But like in games, it's a consistent surface.
Yeah.
Pac-Man metal pipes, Mario metal pipes, Metal Gear Solid metal pipes. There's a lot of metal pipes.
Yeah.
And so we had to get an object that was big enough to walk on and to be able to walk on it with different shoes and get a different sound. Yeah. So the metal pipe conundrum is what we call it. And the last thing we have to do during pre-production is, it's the tough part. It's the inside football part of this. Excel sheets. Google Sheets. We have to figure out schedules and timetables to deliver assets on time to editorial and to implementation. We're building out workflows for cines, gameplay, and hybrid moments. Do you guys have the Domino's pizza tracker? Like here on the web page, like on the app, and it's like, Joanna's making your Foley right now. Oh. Like we imagine like 30 of those going all at once. Yeah. Like we're always like saucing stuff up and putting in the oven, And the very last thing we do in production, this is a long one, is trailers and early vertical slice as like a form of expression. So what I mean by that is oftentimes while the game's still being worked on, we get access to the trailer early, and we get to Foley a lot of the video game trailers that come through.
Sometimes that's our first kind of dive into working on a project is a trailer. So we're establishing things right then and there, and we have to be quick to figure out what's happening, what's going on in this scene, and then also keeping note and keeping track of what we use if it's liked and received well to go back once we're in full production. Yeah,
it's like a great example where it's like if you have a really signature sound, let's say you have a character who has blades for hands.
Yes.
And there's a lot of ways those blades come out of those hands. And so there's a lot of ways we can Foley that. So it kind of gives us a chance to get in early and prototype a bunch of sounds for the developer, right? So that way, if we screw up, we're screwing up on one instance from the trailer and not like the whole game, right? So moving right along ahead. So real quick, how many of y'all have had to fill out like a Foley asset system, like a Foley system for a game you're working on?
Ooh.
Raise them up nice and high.
Yeah.
Okay, y'all can take a nice break and you don't have to look at this because it might give you PTSD, but here's a very small slice of a hypothetical Foley system. So we have two examples here. We have a hypothetical bit of footstep walking and a bit of leather armor. And Blake, do you want to explain what we're showing on the screen?
Yeah, so a lot of what I do is I get to look at all of these sheets and then just let Joanna know where we're going in the session, but this is a very small look at what eventually will be, multiple layers of this. But on the footstep one, we have the footstep walk, and then we have a sneaker selection, and then a surface selection. So when we're starting the character asset session, we will figure out like the shoe of a character that we think is going to work well, and then a surface, and we'll record like the walking of that character on that surface with a few different shoes, and be able to send that off to the director or whoever's the pillar lead on Foley to make sure, okay, these surfaces are going to work for the game, the shoe's going to work for the game, before we fully fledge it out with the running and the jogging and the jumping and the scuffing and the shuffling and the
right.
all that
So this
kind
is
of
just
stuff.
this small chunk of just one form of traversal,
Yeah.
right? So Blake's looking at a sheet that's like 30 times as long as this.
Yeah.
The other thing you see on the right side is like a presumed outfit for a character. Let's say it's a hypothetical leather armor.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'll see up top is short, medium, long. Those are durations. Soft, firm, hard, those are performance styles, right? So we call this an SML. You'll hear us reference this throughout the talk. A short, medium, long system is a way for us to give our developers a bunch of basically clothing performances so that they can mix and match that. So, that way they don't need perfectly performed Foley for every animation in the game. They have a huge library to pull from that has different durations and different performance styles. And that's just leather armor. So if we have a character who can do leather armor, metal armor, regular clothing, we have to do an SML for every single one. And so because this is a lot of work, and obviously this is a small chunk, we kind of figured out a way to do a vertical slice for a vertical slice. We call this the Costco sampling method. You guys have Costco.
You guys have Costco out here?
Costco out here?
Yeah, it's
So-
good on Saturdays.
Great on Saturdays, right? And you know how you go to Costco and you literally just walk around and get samples? Well, right? And that's how you guys have
That's
lunch?
not what we do.
Yeah, it's definitely not what we do. We don't just go there and have our lunch in the form of samples. But basically, the idea of the Costco sampling method is you're going down every column and every row and trying a little bit of everything out, right? So it came to us in a dream while we were at Costco.
While we were at Costco.
But the idea is that you want to iterate on a small but comprehensive slice of the system to confirm that it'll work at scale before we have to multiply these two charts a billion times for different traversal types and different clothing, right? While we're doing that, we're trying to make sure that we're creating enough contrast to help communicate the Foley. That sentence doesn't read right. I'm super sorry. That sounds like technical mumbo jumbo. What I'm trying to say is that the sneakers need to sound different than the boots.
Yeah.
The boots need to sound different than the dress shoes. Concrete has to sound like concrete. We have to create as much contrast in each of these columns and each of these rows. So I'm like doing this because I see the screen here. So I'm like putting my lines through. But the idea is that we don't want to end up in a situation where concrete sounds like metal, right? Because then what was the point?
Yeah.
Whoops, that hit the back button, forward button. I don't have synesthesia, but in my mind, it's like we're assigning shades of colors to different things. So like all the sneakers for me are like red. Boots are like darker red, right? And all like trying to like, in a way, think of it the way a painter would with how many colors can they put on the canvas. And so to that end, I want to show you guys like a really handy tool. The first thing we do is we take concrete as a default surface, and we try every single shoe we're going to use on concrete. The idea is that gives the developers a chance to listen to every shoe and determine if that shoe is going to work for their game, right? And then what we do is you take one shoe and you run it across every surface. So that way they get to hear every surface in the game. So that way if you find out, hey, we don't like your grass, it's a little too hashy. Okay, Blake and I are going to go to the pet store and get some Timothy hay, right? Because we want to make sure your grass sounds unique and sounds good. This, you can see if you do the math, that first grid, that's like 90 different assets, right? It's a 3x3 grid with 10 variations per square. So this is a way of us to save time and to make sure that they like what they like. before we go in and fill out the rest of the grid.
Because often we're doing your main player character, we're doing the NPCs, we're doing the villains, we're doing other swappable characters, and if we figure out something, or if we don't figure it out soon and we go through and do all of that and they don't like it, then it's just a lot of work to have to redo.
Yeah, one time we did a whole system, they hated the sound of grass. And it was like 22 different shoes and like 6 different like traversal types. So we had to reshoot all of the shoes, a lot of grass. So that we're never doing that again. So we should make sure they like the grass before we go nuts.
Yeah.
This next slide is gonna be interesting. This is the thing I care about the most. It's when we go into full-scale production. It's when we go right in, we're gonna shoot a ton of Foley. And so part of full-scale production, every pillar of work, like we had mentioned, has a different workflow. Do you want to talk about cinematic workflow?
Yeah, so when we start for cinematics, we're getting batches of cines from the developer. Those need to be queued, which is just our way of showing what in the cine we're gonna cover. So either Joanna and I, or we have vendors that we have queue for us, we'll go and just watch the cines through. They'll break it out by character and give us all the footsteps, all the moves, all the props that they're working on. And then we record, we edit, we implement.
Right, so queuing is a very unique process. There are people in our industry whose entire careers have been queuing.
Yeah.
Which is nuts to me. It's like, oh, that's all you do is you sit there, watch the film or watch the game, and you target where Foley has to shoot sound effects? It's like, that's a whole job. That's a whole career. Like, people have paid for mortgages with that career. Like, it's pretty amazing. So basically, the interesting caveat to that is if you have cinematics that have new animation tech, like let's say you have a really cool liquid simulation that is like super high tech, super proprietary, no one's used it yet, we want to do those last because we don't want to accidentally overinvest in the cool sounds of water and then find out, hey, we slowed all the water down. We're gonna have to reshoot that whole scene. The next thing we do is gameplay system workflow. We transition from that vertical slice we showed you earlier of just doing all concrete and all of the sneaker, and we fill out the grid.
Yeah.
Right? So that's where we really sit down and go, okay, let's review the notes and let's iterate and let's just complete all their requests. And during that time, vignettes get interwoven. Do you want to talk about God of War a little bit and how?
Yeah, so in God of War, there was a bunch of, what do they call them, gameplay moments or something like that, where we're going from gameplay into a little bit of a cinematic where you have some player input back out and in and bobbing and weaving. So we got to find those areas like we were mentioning before. There's people arm wrestling. We're walking through an area with gameplay. We have to mark out and find all of those loops that are happening of the people arm wrestling, who's winning that time, that kind of thing. Record all that while having... I lost it.
Well, I mean, what it is that the cinematic for that particular section of the game, we'll do months later.
Oh, sure.
So for example, if we do a vignette in like a zoo, and we did that 6 months ago, and then finally 6 months later, it's like, hey, here's the cinematic with that same zoo. Yeah. We need consistency there. And so basically, that's how we get into a game. When it comes to cinematics, we try to take every lesson we learned during pre-production. Every little moment where we got notes back about whether they like the trailer or not, we apply it to cinematics. And frankly, this is where I thrive. Cinematics, I could spend an entire talk just on doing Foley for cinematics. Like, these games are like, 6 hours worth of cines long sometimes? It's like, it's equivalent to doing like 3 Marvel films back to back, right?
It's definitely the most fun and most rewarding because we're getting to see the story arc, we're getting to see character development, we're getting to move a lot instead of just putting down, 7,000 footsteps in a row, that kind of thing. Right.
We start setting shoes, surfaces, and key props for each character. This occurs in tandem with gameplay very often. So we'll have a day where, like, hey, here's, we'll talk about him later, but like, oh, here's Heimdall from God of War. We have all of his taunt animations, do that. Okay, here's every cinematic involving Heimdall. Okay, do that. So it's like, that's where we start setting the props, making sure that they go consistently from all these different pillars of gameplay. And we also work with vendor partners. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. When Joanna and I started, we started, mid and end of production for Horizon and God of War. So there was already Foley teams on those projects. So when we got brought in to help, we had to, collaborate with them, talk to them, see what they were using for their prop choices and shoe choices, see how to match those appropriately so what we recorded fit right in with what they had already done.
Yeah, we have a group chat where it's just like the LA Foley team, us, and like our friends in the UK, just being like, "Ooh, look what I did for this character. Yeah. That's sweet, awesome." Like Dawn Lunsford, great Foley artist, she would text me updates on like, "Oh, here's what I used for this. Here's what I used for Thrud." I'd be like, "Great, I don't have a duster, 2 leather purses, a whole rotisserie chicken." Like she'll show me very specifically what she has, and I'll sit there being like, do we have that? You know. But what matters is that we get to hear what they're doing and see what they're using, and then give it our spin, right? It's not necessarily our job to perfectly replicate what they did. What matters is that you, the player, when you're playing the game, you don't notice that Thread's clothing might have changed a little bit. Notes. Oh dear Lord, notes. Basically, when we're doing full-scale production of cinematics, like we said, we don't get the cines in order. It is a hodgepodge. It's like that movie Memento, like Christopher Nolan. Like, we're getting the whole game out of sequence, out of order, so we have to constantly take notes. I have like this, I call it the Bible, and it's basically like this giant notebook full of different shoes for different characters, and I don't want to follow it to the word sometimes, but like, we call it that because if I lose that book, we're kind of screwed. Like it literally has everything I need to know to shoot the characters and the surfaces. But I mean, you take notes too, right? Yeah,
during production, in all the Excel sheets, we'll have a notes page where we're keeping the recipes that she's using. We also have the iPad, which we're taking videos of the performance of how she's holding the things, how they're stacked, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and the biggest thing though, and this is something I really want to push forward for everyone in this audience. What are our stakes and payoffs in every single cinematic? You know, I think it's really easy to think of Foley as this extremely literal thing. Like, big man, walk over, pick up cup, sip, put down cup. Like, it's very easy to see Foley as just that. But it's like, no, he's thirsty. He needs water. You know what I mean? Like, and if he drinks that water, he'll be ready for the next challenge. So it's like, that's kind of like the difference, right? Like, instead of seeing things as such literal interpretations, we have to know what are our stakes and payoffs in every single scene. And the last thing is, we've kind of talked about it, but how does the rest of the game interplay with the cinematic? You know, if I find out that if you have a fail state that completely alters your cinematic, we need to know that. Because that means the character's walking in with like a bit of sadness, you know, or a bit of weight, kind of screwed up. So that affects and informs the performance of the Foley. And that being said, my biggest philosophy is this concept called "Who's Got the Pain?" I kind of stole it from a song, from a musical called Damn Yankees. It's a really old Bob Fosse musical, and basically after Act 1, they start Act 2 off with this very farcical number where Bob Fosse and Gwen Verdon are dancing. It's a total clown show. You know, it's a very silly song. It's really fun. It's like who's got the pain and the mambo. It's like this whole like joking bit. But if you actually sit down and read the lyrics, it is like dark. They're basically saying like, well, I have it way harder than you, dude. And he's like, no, I got it way harder than you. I screwed up in Act 1. You know, and so the idea there is that these people are like putting these fake smiles on and like tearing off their skin on the inside, and they're trying to convey like, well, no, I'm the one who's suffering, right? And so when I think about these cinematics, I'm always thinking, who's got the pain? Who's got your attention? Who's got your emotional investment, right? And I say performance is such a vague term. You know, what about the performance changes the sound? You know, so what about the way they're acting and the way they're passing the scene back and forth to each other? How does that actually change the Foley? You know, who gets priority in the scene? Who's leading? Who's supporting? And as a result, that's how you figure out the narrative and character arc of every individual cine. Everyone walks into a cinematic and then walks out. And you have to figure out what changed between point A to point B. Who's got the pain is like a really easy way to ask yourself, like where is the emotional velocity of the scene? And who has the central most conflict in this scene? And so we actually have a great example from God of War that we'll play at the end of this presentation that is just an expression of who's got the pain. There's also a matter of Chekhov's guns. Like, what's the setup and payoff of anyone's scene based on props? Yeah. Right. So like, what's a good example of like a Chekhov's gun or?
Yeah, in Horizon there was. We were working with one of our sound designers, Andres Herrera, and we had to get the sound of this book. And the Foley that had been recorded before, or the sound effects or whatever, it was just like this kind of weightless little book that they were grabbing. But what was at the end of that was in this book was what they needed to succeed. So we were asked to record it to give it a little more emotion, give it a little more weight, big, heavy, thick, leathery, creaky, something that imbued some sense of emotion.
Right. The other thing is that characterizing your props, like if you're like an old guy, you're sitting down in an old wooden chair, that chair's gonna sound different than if you're like a spry young person, right? And the very last thing, and this is something I want every Foley person to understand, is what is the efficacy of our efforts? Like, is it actually working? You know, if I go and get an ancient 8,000-year-old Chinese oak chair, and I'm like, yeah, this thing's gonna rock, and I sit down and it just sounds like a silly plop. Like, you know, was it worth bringing that in all the way from Taiwan or mainland China? Like, no. Like, we have to ask ourselves the efficacy of like, are we translating, are we communicating what we need to do, or is this kind of wasted effort, right? And so this metaphor is kind of the way I see Foley. If cinematics are impressionistic paintings, then gameplay is pointillism, or at worst, paint by numbers. You might be wondering, what the heck does that jumble of words mean? Well, impressionism, obviously, you know, we're guys like Manet were trying to capture, like, how does light feel on your eyes? Like, not necessarily photorealism, but how does light affect you? And how does it convey the scene in front of you? And so Foley for cinematics is like that. We're doing these long brush strokes, right? Like, when you put me in record for Kratos walking from point A to point B, it's not like you're stopping to get me in every single footstep.
Right. No, I've worked with quite a few Foley artists, and Joanna's pretty special. She's very good at sight reading, so a lot of times when we get, 30 minutes of cinematics to do for a couple weeks, we don't have necessarily the time just to sit and watch through and figure out what's going on all at once. She's able to watch it pretty much as we are in record and almost nail it right then and there. So we kind of are just going these big strokes, and she'll get it. If it's not perfectly in sync, but it sounds all right, and she knows and understands the emotion, then we'll just move on to the next one.
Right. So that's what I mean by broad brush strokes. Pointillism, this is, I believe it's Saturday at the Park with George, or that's the name of the musical it's based on. I like musical theater, that's where I came from. But basically, George Seurat, and gameplay for me is like pointillism, right? Because we're giving you little dots. We're giving you lots and lots of different colors and lots of different sizes of dots. And it's your job as the viewer to get that impressionistic quality, whether you're standing up close to it or far away from it, right? And so this is kind of how I see the difference between gameplay and cinematics. It's all impressionistic. It's all just painting with sound. But these are the brushstrokes that we use to achieve that goal. And then we get to full-scale production of gameplay. We have a philosophy for every single step of the way. Our overarching philosophy is authorship of the player, and we mean you, right? You're projecting your emotional state as you play the game into the Foley, right? So when I do a running sequence I would do a running set of feet for a character, I'm not gonna know whether or not those running feet are gonna be for the protagonist trying to catch up to rescue somebody or somebody running away from a bad guy. Like, I won't know that, but you will. Right? So we want to give you authorship over the Foley you listen to. And we also have this new fourth wall. We're here to make sure that your player experience doesn't react to like an obvious loop. And the other thing is that there's only so much that we can do to make our Foley utilitarian. It's all about bespoke work. So if we're doing a non-player character library versus an enemy library, it's going to sound different. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, if we're doing just like a regular like people in the park NPC library, they're probably going to have like non-gritty, clean footsteps. The steps aren't going to be too over exaggerated, that kind of thing. But if we're doing like an NPC or an enemy NPC library, they might have some grit on their feet. They might be stomping a little bit harder, so you can kind of tell their emotion just in the way we're choosing props and surfaces. Totally.
An enemy running towards you is going to sound different than like a civilian running towards you. Super important for the contrast for design purposes. Like we mentioned, if you're a combat designer, you want to make sure that all the footsteps the enemy is approaching like convey the level of threat that they have in their feet, right? And oftentimes in order to do that, we will use shoes that bend reality. We will use surfaces that convey the environment as a gameplay feature, and we'll try to give a motivation for why characters are moving. You want the Goldilocks zone of variation versus consistency. So this is kind of an inside baseball thing, but
yeah. So Goldilocks zone is the not too cold, not too hot, just kind of right. If we're doing an asset library and we know that it's going to be a small amount of variation assets, say like 10 for footsteps, we don't want to do so many that are a light footstep and so many that are hard, because as those cycle in the in the library selection, those are going to pop out. So we try to give them just enough flow.
Right, just enough variation that they're different, but not so much that any one of them sticks out and you're like, oh, that's a freaking loop. You know what I mean? So it's a Goldilocks zone. All these mean that we have these very narrow canvases to paint with. The other thing is that when you looked at that SML sheet earlier with me, that's kind of like what the end result is when we deliver it back to implementation, right? But sometimes what they need, they describe that to us in very literal ways. Other times, we actually have to be we have to think abstractly about their needs, right? Also, where in the workflow does sound design get to play, and can we just keep layers split? That basically a lot of Foley's multiple sounds added up together, right? And so if we're creating assets, oftentimes those get burned together into one file and then deployed in the game. However, if I were to give you 3 leather and 3 metal, you can, if you were able to put the technical debt in early to deploy those 3 as separate, or those 2 different layers as separate layers, that gives you 9 variations, right? Because it's 3 by 3. This is the hard part. Sometimes we'll have a great idea for Foley and have all these cool layers, but then to tell a technical audio designer or an implementer, like, hey, can we have this multiplex through it? They'll be like, dude, no, the game comes out next month. Like, we do not have time to put that in. A great example of that is the loading screen for God of War Ragnarok. That's like 3 separate clothing layers for Kratos. Like, what do we use for that?
Yeah, he's just sitting there kind of breathing. So like when you pick up the game, it's just an easy flow back into where you left off. But he's sitting there, he's breathing, he's got a leather pass, so we're creaking leather as it's going. He's got his armor on, so we got some metal plates going, that kind of thing. And then we got the weapons on his back. So we have those 3 layers that can be played and mix and match, so they can, at different times, they'll sound like it's all just new material.
Right, and we'd do 20 seconds loops of each, 3 20-second loops of each of that, so that way Nick Tomasetti, our sound designer who was responsible for that, could like mix and match them to create like 3 times 20, 60 times, math. Yeah, okay, I can't do the math. I'm a Foley artist. But basically, that's what I mean by that. Also, a little bit of math for you guys. We're supervisors as well as, we supervise Foley as well as shoot it. So for one day of recording Foley, we often create enough work for almost 2 whole days of editorial to mix and master like gameplay assets.
Yeah, like when we're recording cinematics, we're having big batches of them in our Pro Tools session. And the way we have it queued out by clip groups, I can search by name, so I can find everything that's on concrete by Kratos. And then she can throw on the boots, and we can just hit all of those. So we're able to kind of batch them and shoot pretty fast. But those are going to be spread out over a lot of cinematics. Or if we're doing the same thing for assets, we can look at the surface and then just keep swapping those shoes real quick. So we can do all of that recording pretty fast. And then when it gets into editorial, that's where it slows down a bit, because they got to then put everything to sync, or they have to edit and mix and master all the assets.
Yeah, so by that I mean gameplay. Obviously, how many of y'all are familiar with Wise? Like the default middleware, right? So you all know that like all this stuff gets normalized to get put into the game, right? So that means denoising, that means that means basically establishing the Goldilocks zone. So our Foley editor, Austin Creek, he'll be like, oh, Joanna, that sword spike was like way too much. I'm getting rid of that one. You know, okay, you guys have to record one more for me. You know, like that's part of the process. Also, iteration. So once all that stuff gets put in and implemented, we actually have to figure out, does it actually work once it's in the game? Like, does it actually sound good? Because it might sound perfect in your control room or for me in my studio, but if we're playing the game and there's constantly going to be wind underneath, or there's going to be big enemy effects, like we want to make sure the Foley still works once it's actually inside the game. And so that's kind of like the the loop. That's the golden loop for us as a team. And the thing we do with hybrid systems, you know, we have to ask ourselves, like, at what point does gameplay end and a hybrid system begin, right? Games like God of War and pretty much all the PlayStation games make really good use of the new SSD to make sure that you don't really feel the loading at all. And the result of that is that when we get gameplay captures, it kind of blurs, like, okay, where exactly are we? Do we have a little developer tool that tells us, okay, at this moment you're now in this GPM? Yeah. At what point does a set piece break from cinematics and goes back into gameplay? Like, these are all the weird connective tissues that you'll see in hybrid systems. The other thing is that when we're dealing with vignettes in any one setting, the big question we ask the developers, can we get a different camera angle? Like, if there is arm wrestling over here, and I'm only ever getting a capture of it over somebody's shoulder, I won't be able to see like everything that's happening that needs Foley. So sometimes we ask people, hey, go into debug tool and like get us a cleaner capture of whatever's going on in the corner. And also, how does the loop work? There's split offs, like all these different things that we ask, right? And also, how do you want us to deliver these assets? You want us to label each loop? It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
Like when I signed up for this job, I was like, great, I'm banging coconuts for like a horse and stuff. And it's like I literally have to sit there and like use critical thinking to understand like how are we making this work?
It's a lot of emailing.
It's a lot of emailing.
Yeah.
Like we one time had a moment where they're like, we want to reshoot all the feet for this galloping wolf character. And it was like, is your team ready to do that with us? Because like we'll reshoot it, but like that's a lot of additional work to get it to get in the game. So in that case, that one we really had to convey like, hey, how do you want us to actually deliver this? Because that's going to change how I perform it, right? So like when I do an animal, like a quadrupedal like character, you know, I'm on all fours and I'm like hitting the ground in these galloping steps. But if they're not able to like isolate the performance and have it trigger properly with the event calling, then I might have just given them like Garbo, you know? So I have to understand how it works. And the last thing we do in post-production is we stay accountable, you know?
Yeah, we just want to make sure we're putting our best foot forward, ensuring that we're syncing everything correctly, and that it when played, everything fits and works together. And giving ourselves enough time on the end to make sure that we can fix mistakes or changes that come along if there was a surface change in the game, you know, all that kind of stuff.
Right. We also just get our feedback. Does the sound work at scale? You know, when I say staying accountable, I mean not just letting it go. I think a lot of times in the game industry, you give something to a vendor to shoot or create sounds for. They create sounds, they throw it back over the bridge, and then obviously the question comes, hey, how did it work?
Yeah.
And a lot of times we were like, it worked just fine. It worked great. Don't worry about it. And whereas because we're part of, you know, PlayStation.
Yeah, we want to make sure that like just because we recorded something doesn't mean that it has to be used. Like if it generally doesn't work or it's not liked, we want to make that follow through easier for the developers to not have to bring us bad news. We're just wanting to preemptively get that out of the way.
Right. There's a certain amount of like office politicking when it comes to game dev. You know what I mean? Like you have only so many asks you can put in or put out there. So the big thing we want to do is to make sure that people feel okay telling us, hey, that was not good enough. You know. And if it isn't good enough, what point do we go back and fix things? You know, recently we worked on a project where a character was wearing like a spiky belt and some leather, and once they actually put it in game, all you can hear was the belt. Right, because all the leather is like that good mid-range, and it was just being sucked up by everything else. So we actually were like, wait, we don't have to reshoot it. Let's use some multi-band compression. Let's try to tame the highs, and then bring the level up and see if that fixes it. And it totally did. And obviously, all of this is try to stay consistent. We want to make sure our performance and characterization, scene to scene, cine to cine, and all these different ways you can bob and weave as a player, makes it into the game. So if a really major plot point happens, I can't just walk the footsteps out like all happy and squirrely, like on the GPM pickup at the end of the cine, right? Like we have to make sure we have consistency there. And do you want to talk about this? This is the one step up thing where it's like.
Yeah, I think saying all that with all the pre-production that we can do and with all the note taking that we can do, we can only go. There's only so much we can do, but if say the shoe that we've decided and the surface we've decided isn't working for the scene, if it's just not translating, then we just have to do what sounds good at that point. So that might mean we change something. So as much as we want to hold true to being consistent and not letting you guys in on the secret, if the staying consistent is going to be the thing that pulls you out of it, that's what we got to change.
Right, so I'll give you an example. Thor. Is performed by me as well as Don Lunsford at Formosa, right? So all of Thor's footsteps and clothing was a collaboration where we set the tone, we set what the leather should sound like, we sent her the files, we sent her the photos, and then we didn't care that she used something different. You know, she went for like this abstract idea of what does the character actually stand for and why do they sound the way they do with their footsteps, right? And so consistency isn't just a matter of forensic reality, it's a matter of like performance reality. Do the performances match? And the last thing we do is we actually talk to QA testers about whether or not they like our game. You know, our Foley stage is right next to the playtest area at PlayStation. So literally after we finish a cinematic and like a month later, after all of it's done and pressed into a new build, we can actually walk over and be like, hey, Jimmy, you liking that game? What do you think of that giant set piece? Did it actually sound good? Like, we're able to actually get feedback from people who are playing our game and aren't necessarily audio people. Like, that's the big thing as audio folks. We need to be getting player feedback from people who are not in audio, because you'll quickly figure out what actually matters and what doesn't.
Yep.
And audio QA sweeps, very specifically audio QA. Like, we're really lucky that we have an entire team dedicated just to listen to the game, play it back, and give us feedback. And importance of us playing the game.
Yeah.
So here's a case study. I want to talk a little bit about Heimdall from God of War Ragnarok with the remaining time we have. This character was a collaboration among 3 Foley studios. Right, it's us, Formosa Interactive, and Molinaire in the UK. And we have to communicate his characterization to all the other teams involved. We also had listened to a lot of the samples, as we had mentioned before, but we got to set the tone for Heimdall. There's a great YouTube video out there that has all of Heimdall's cinematics strung together as like a let's play, and it like makes my heart so happy because I'm like, oh, we were given that character front to end, and you can actually hear how we were able to maintain consistency for him. And we were given basically all of his taunts and gameplay mechanics, so we could Foley all of it the same way. And the biggest thing we had to convey, and I kind of wish I put this as the first bullet point, this guy's an arrogant and haughty, like you love to hate him. He's like one of those villains that you just love to hate. Like, he annoys you with how much he gets away with. And the other thing we had to do is, because we got to do him from front to end of the game, we had to make sure that his first scene really sets up how arrogant he is, how haughty he is, so that way when you finally get a chance to fight him in the game, the payoff is enormous, right? So we had this scene, just a quick content warning. He does,
someone gets punched.
Someone gets punched pretty good. Yeah, just an FYI. We really enjoyed doing this scene, so we're gonna play it back down. This is just Foley isolated. So you see how there's like a beginning, middle.
I think there was a little HDMI sync lag.
Trust us in sync. But you can see right there is a great execution of like who's got the pain, right? Like the emotional truth of the scene wavers between you wanting Thread to punch that guy in the face, right? And he just kicks away all the momentum she had. To the point where she's on the ground and it ends with him swooping down and like looking at her like, oh, I'd love to see you try, you know? And so it's like, for us, that whole scene wasn't like, okay, footstep, 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 kick, footstep, footstep. Like, we actually want to make sure that velocity is there. But my favorite part of that performance is he kind of goose steps. He's like such a bully. He's kind of a fascist. And you could see it right there with that shot, you know what I mean? So when we saw that cinematic early, we immediately texted Dawn and Alicia over from us like, hey, if you ever get this character, walk him in Hard Soul shoes and make sure you really get that like toe heel, like always so sure of himself, like performance. Because obviously that's what our actor was giving that day. And so the other thing about God of War is that these are a lot of the same shaped characters wearing the same shoes on the same surface. So the way you characterize them and create contrast is in the performance rather than materials. So by that, I mean Kratos, if you play the game and crank the Foley up, Kratos never shuffles. Like even if he's like shifting his weight like this, every footstep is like he doesn't F around. Like every step is a full step. Heimdall obviously has a goose step. Atreus has a lot of spring and bite to his footsteps, so we made sure that his shoes kind of had a little bit more like lifted mids in them.
Got more youth.
More youth in the shoes. And Odin, my favorite bit about Odin is that we gave him soft shuffly steps. Like it didn't matter how precise he was walking, all of his footsteps are like shuffly and kind of like he's an old man. But the reason why we highlighted that is because he's a manipulative person. He doesn't need to be physically imposing to get you to do awful things in the game. So we wanted to like present that in the form of his feet. He doesn't need to be the one to put the blade on your neck. He'll get someone else to do it. And so the other thing we do is some live effects.
Yeah, so in the control room, I'm doing stuff like EQ, pitch shifting, using the harmonizer and sub-harmonizer to give people weight when they need it, or actually taking away weight. If some two similar characters on screen and the surface we're using is really boomy or whatever, sometimes I might dial back the low end just to give the contrast between the people on screen.
Totally. Like I'll admit it. I'm pretty heavy. I'm 260 pounds. So it's like not too hard for me to walk heavy, but walking light can be difficult sometimes, which is fun. It means I'm never running out of level for you.
Right.
But it also means that if we have a big wood surface, especially like a little kid, it's like, okay, Blake, cut the lows for me, would you? And the other thing is we wanted to set up Heimdall super early, so that way you can tell he's such a different character to Kratos. Like I said, these are all people with very similar shoes, very similar surfaces. They're all gods, so they're all strong. But you have to really make sure that we set them up in such precise ways early so we can pay it off. And the last slide we want to talk about is just considerations for genre. At PlayStation, we're kind of shapeshifters. If we're working on a show like MLB The Show 23, it has more baseball assets in it than like a film, like a feature film about baseball.
Than all of the feature films of baseball.
All of baseball, yeah. So it's like a live service title. So we got to record the sound of baseballs hitting every possible surface you can hit in the game. It was like, how many days did we do on that?
We did it for like a week. It was thousands upon thousands of baseball drops.
Yeah, so I'm sitting there with like actual baseballs and hitting them, getting deflections. But then other times I was using like one of those I think it was like cute like purple back massagers, ball on a stick things. We used that too, and so I loved it. It was like a Russian novel. I walked away from that session fully understanding what a baseball sounds like like as like a platonic ideal of what a baseball sounds like. Other games we worked on Firewall Ultra. It's basically a tactical shooter in VR. So in that case, we had to completely throw away certain elements and focus on making sure that you as a player, when you got the headset on, you can actually hear like who's coming around the corner, right? And the last game in considerations for genre, Horizon Forbidden West, we got brought on during crunch on that project. So we were the how do I put this? You ever been to a shopping mall or a food court and they got like custom pasta? Like the guy will cook the pasta in front of you, choose your sauces, your toppings. We were like that, but for Foley. And obviously from all these food metaphors, I'm getting kind of hungry for dinner. So that was like a lot of fun. It was a totally different way of shooting Foley. We're just getting requests the day of and immediately just like, all right, you want Alfredo? Okay. So like just go constantly making sure people got the things they needed.
I think we have 20 seconds left.
20 seconds. Okay, wrapping it all up. Blah, 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 blah. Staying unpretentious, no navel gazing. Delivering iterative promises made the development player, supporting the developer, and being more artistically and emotionally invested. And we care about creating performances over product. We are a verb, not just a noun. And so in the past, Foley teams were just another contracted service, but we are sound-driven.
Developer-supported, developer-driven, sound-supported.
Yep. So thank you so much.
That was absolutely stunning. I had been looking forward to this session and you did not disappoint. And I'm now overthinking how I walk. And and how it sounds.
Yeah.
What a terrifying way to experience the world. We're going to do a really quick Q&A because we've had so many excellent questions come through, even though we are running just a little bit over. But Nick would like to know, did you set out to become a Foley artist, or did you just kind of fall into it?
It's a really interesting question. So basically, basically, I moved to New York wanting to be the next Jeff Buckley. Like, I wanted to be a singer-songwriter. And my performance anxiety was way over the charts. Like, you can see how much I'm sweating right now talking to y'all. But Foley basically combined all these things I loved. And so I didn't go to New York to become a Foley artist. I went there to be open to all this different expressive and artistic behavior around me. And when I discovered Foley, I was like, oh my God, here's this thing I love that really fits me. That's when I decided to transition to becoming a Foley artist.
Yeah, I knew I wanted to do something with sound for a while. I went to school to record music, and then within a post-production chapter of my schooling, I got to put sound effects to a thing, and then that with some divine intervention, I met the guys at One Step Up, befriended them. They said, hey, we need a mixer, and I was doing ADR at the time, and then the rest is history.
Yeah. Beautiful. What is your go-to studio mic and Foley mic?
Ooh, that's a fun question. So studio mic, you mean like what do they mean by that versus Foley mic?
Are you in the room, Artemis?
I meant like field mic.
Oh, field mic. Okay, I love that. Okay, so in the studio, we're not really. Actually, this is a great Blake question.
Yeah, I've been using the Sennheiser MKH 800 almost my entire career. I really do like the Sennheiser 416, and then we've been using the KMR 81 quite a bit at PlayStation.
Yeah, also the 100K. So if we're out field recording, often the 100K is the first thing that goes on a stand. I mean, that mic is Sanken. Yeah, that thing's so expensive, but get an insurance policy for it, and the world's your oyster. So we love taking those mics out on the road. We're not we're not dogmatic about what mic we use in the studio. Like,
sometimes we just get bored and I just want to use something else to see if the sound's going to be something. So we are blessed at PlayStation to have a mic locker that we get to play around with, and sometimes people send us mics to try out. So we recognize our position, but we use it as much as we can.
Right.
Not in a bad way. That sounded really weird. Sorry.
I love the deep technical nerd energy of highscore. It's always just the absolute best. How do you stay sane/organized while working across multiple titles, each at different stages of production? Do you have an audio producer/project manager?
Thing is, we don't. No, just kidding. That's my secret captain. I'm always crazy. So basically, we're really lucky. Every project we have has a production manager on it for sound, and so they're the ones who are helping us filter through requests. And at the same time, we meet once every week to just go through every project that we're on board for and give out updates on, like, oh, this project we're doing the pre-pro on this element, or this project we started the vertical slice on.
We also instituted every other Friday a Bourbon with Blake session, so
yeah, that's the balance of the equation is a little bit of bourbon.
I want to work there. All right. When you are doing ads, shuffles, scuffs, and ancillary actions, do you also deliver left and right options, or reuse them and only deliver those for steps?
Something we found out is that, like, left rights. I understand why they exist. It makes sense from an animation standpoint, you know what I mean? Like, if you're chunking up a walk cycle to be left foot, right foot, it does make sense that, like, okay, those are different. But unfortunately, we've noticed that if you were to make a dedicated left foot, a dedicated right foot library, sometimes it sounds too A-B. And it can get a little much. So we've definitely done games where they want us to do a left-right system, and it makes sense to have contextually stepping with your right foot triggers a different set of animations. Like, it especially makes sense in, like, games where you have a sword stance or you have, like, a weapon in hand. So sidestepping left or sidestepping backwards, it makes sense that you want left and right traversal. But typically we don't do that because there's not, when it comes to shuffles, there's only so many variations we can give before there's diminishing returns, right? And so we want to make sure that, like, if we're going to be doing large, almost redundant, like, amounts of feet, we want to make sure that it all sounds unique.
When working on multiple games simultaneously, is there any concern about blurring the sonic identity of each game? How do you keep the sound world separate? Oh, yes.
Yes. This is the question. I love this question. Oh my God. Okay, so, like, obviously, because we have a lot of the same people working on a lot of different games, we really do make sure that we're not creating just a homogenous product, right? I sometimes worry there's this sound. There's this great YouTuber who talked about this recently about, like, the AAA sound. And it's just like, oh, it's just subharmonic that just like wobs into everything. It's like guy picks up a piece of paper, it's like wah, wah, wah. You know what I mean? There's kind of this like stereotype of AAA sounding titles. And so we definitely try to make sure to avoid that to which point, perfect question. I actually have these boots here, and they've been part of the Foley stage at Sony even before Blake and I started working here. You've heard these boots before. Our coworker Juliet Rascon used
Can I
these.
touch them?
You can touch them. They're
Oh my God.
gross.
Don't smell them.
Don't smell them.
Oh, now
For
I'm
the love of
tempted.
God. But our coworker Juliet Rascon.
They actually don't smell that bad.
Okay, this shoe smells worse. But basically.
Why am I? Anyway, keep talking.
And so Juliet.
That one does smell worse. Okay.
Right. I'm convinced that like somebody sweats a little.
It's because this one's open. Anyway. Sorry.
So you've heard these shoes before. This is the shoe that our coworker Juliet used for Sam's footsteps in Death Stranding 1.
I'm gonna take a selfie with a shoe.
So the reason why I brought them is because they're a cherished prop. But we actually kind of semi-retired these shoes because they're so iconic in a game that's so focused on Foley. And so when we got to work on the trailer recently, we brought them out of retirement. We like went to the bin, we grabbed all the Death Stranding stuff, and we're like, okay, this shoe will never get used in any other video game except for that one. So that's kind of how we maintain variety. There's some shoes that are just, they sound too specific. Like I have a pair of shoes that I call Kratos shoes, because that was the one we used to match what the other Foley team did for Kratos. And those shoes are heavy. A lot of it is effects, right? How much do you use?
Yeah, I mean, we just have to keep in mind, like, if I'm always pulling for the same tricks, always using the same sense on the pitch or going for that sub-harmonizer, then our stuff will sound the same. So we just have to make an intentional purpose to try something different each time.
Yeah, we almost overcompensate.
Yeah.
Is it giving Sam? All right, and I think we have time for one last question. What are the main differences between sound effects and Foley?
Ooh, okay, so you know that there's that meme where it's a chart where it's like a bell curve, and then like at both extreme ends they're the same opinion, but in the middle someone's like, no, they're different. So it's kind of interesting because in the past you would define sound effects and like hard effects as like something that you can find in a library, something that already exists that you could like match up and sync and call it, right? And Foley we saw as like anything that was character driven, like footsteps, cloth, and props. But the middle of the hump, that's like kind of like for a lot of folks here who shoot Foley as well as sound design their games, they're like on one side of the bell curve where it's like, it's all just kind of the same thing. It's all just one process to get unique sound effects that trigger and convey emotion. In the middle of the hump, you have me like 5 years ago, being like, no, they're so different. They're such different things. And then at the other end of the hump, you have me now where I'm like, no, they're extremely blurred. Right? Like, because our sound designers aren't just mindlessly taking library sounds and putting them in. They're trying to create a performance with EQ and reverb. They're trying to create a performance in the selection of sound effects they have in these libraries, or even going out there and field recording their own, or even shooting essentially Foley in their own rooms, right? So they're already doing that. I think the big difference for us is that obviously I'm like completely performance oriented, right? And so I'm thinking like the way an actor would think about sound. And so that's the big difference for me is that like it's that and it's like infinite DDR. Like, Foleying a scene is just DDR, but like the world is your dance pad and every prop is like an object. You know, like every prop's an
And
instrument.
sometimes you can't see like the map of what you're doing. You just have to guess.
You just have to guess, just to go for it. So like that's the big difference. And so I think my new definition is that Foley sounds that you have to, like in the moment you create it, you have to have context. And it has to be performed with that knowledge. Like that's the difference for me. Whereas SFX that you find in a library were created specifically to just be used for anything. Right? And so our stuff's super bespoke. At the moment it's recorded, the moment that object creates waves in the room before it hits the mic, it was intended. Whereas the sound effects in the library, the intention, like even Boom Library, the intention is broad, right? So that's the big difference for me now.
I could listen to you talk probably forever, but we are not allowed to do that. So thank you so much for all of your time and expertise.
Thank you.